Happy Thursday, Facebook friends. Welcome back to Facebook. I'm Angie Garza, Director of Professional Learning and Educational Services at ROE47, serving Lee, Ogle, and Whiteside counties. And if you're joining us back here this fine Thursday on Facebook, you'll know that it's time for another edition of Teacher Talk. And today's Teacher Talk is a special one. I know we say that all the time, but it truly is a wonderful conversation that we are going to be having about all things literacy. That's right, reading and writing. And all of this in preparation for our third annual Transitional English Language Arts Summit on Friday, December 13th from 8:30 to noon on Zoom. But more on that in just a moment. I know that I have to right now welcome my friend, colleague, and co-host, Ms. Stacey Dingus, to our Teacher Talk platform because she and I kind of have a shared vested interest in this conversation. We are kindred spirits in that we both taught English language arts. I taught English and foreign language at the high school level, and Stacey, you taught English language arts at the middle school level. So these conversations are always so invigorating and call back to our time in the classroom. So I'm really excited to be having these conversations with you today.
Good morning, Angie. This is definitely a conversation that I am excited about. I feel like it has been a little bit since we've kind of focused back to content in the classroom, this being a subject area that definitely interests me as a past English language arts teacher. Also, I find this conversation interesting because I have a daughter that will be entering college, and we talked a little bit before we pushed record that the expectations in college are maybe a little different than years ago when I was in school, even when I was in the classroom and what I was teaching the students. So excited to have this conversation this morning.
I love this idea about, and you're right, we did talk about this before we pushed the record button, but just this genuine thought, conversation about what on earth are we preparing students for. And I think sometimes, especially as I reflect on my career as a high school educator, I knew that I was teaching to the standards. I knew that I was teaching the students in front of me, but my goal was to get them out the door at graduation and maybe not necessarily recognizing that I was preparing them for something much greater, much bigger, and how important those conversations are between secondary to post-secondary and secondary to our workforce. And so as we think about this idea of communication, writing, reading, what is it that we are preparing students for? What's important for our students to know, be able to do, to understand, to embrace? And so, in the spirit of those conversations, I mentioned that we have an upcoming summit. It's our third annual Transitional English Language Arts Summit to be held virtually on Friday, December 13th from 8:30 to noon on Zoom. And as part of that summit, we bring secondary and post-secondary educators, administrators, counselors together to have really in-depth collaborative conversations about the very question of what are we preparing students for? In particular, what are we preparing them for when it comes to reading and writing? Transitional English, for those of our viewers who are not aware, is a course that is offered at the high school level, where if students take the course, which is aligned to very special competencies and policies as outlined by the Illinois State Board of Education and the Illinois Community College Board, as well as the Illinois Board of Higher Education, and they pass that course with a C or better, they're allowed to enter directly into credit-bearing coursework at the post-secondary level. But as you might imagine, that takes a lot of conversation and communication and collaboration between the worlds of secondary and post-secondary, and it takes partnerships. And so as we bring our educators together this year for our summit, we are so pleased to welcome our keynote speaker, John Warner. John, who you're going to meet here in just a moment, is an author. He's a columnist, he's an educator, and he has lots of wonderful thoughts and reflections on what that question of what are we preparing students for. And so we are so pleased to welcome him not only to our summit, but also here to our Teacher Talk platform this morning. John, welcome. Thank you so much for being here with us this morning here on Teacher Talk. And as we get going, we had lots of conversations prior to recording here this morning, but and we know a lot about your background, but I was wondering if you might be able to share a little bit of your background with our listening community and talk about this passion that you have for writing because it's what you do full time now, I think you mentioned.
It's great to be here and very much looking forward to the conference coming up. Yeah, my roots go deep. I grew up in a house filled with books. My mom started a bookstore in the town I grew up in, Northbrook, Illinois, when I was a year old. So in 1971, the book bin of Northbrook opened, and I was sitting in a bassinet in the back office while she and three partners started this bookstore that is still there. It's still open. So I'm 54, so that means it must be 53 years old. She sold it quite a long time ago, but it still exists. And my interest in writing really just came from reading. I loved reading. I was, an introverted kid who, I played sports and liked to be outside and do kid stuff, but I'd be very, very happy with a book in my room by myself, having those experiences. And then writing just became a natural outgrowth of that interest in reading. If you read a lot, I think you begin to get fascinated with the idea of, well, how is this thing made? Why did that do that to me? Why when I was 9 or 10 and I read Bridge to Terabithia for the first time, why did I start crying when something happened in the book, right? That this is a sort of amazing thing. These are non-existent people, and somehow somebody has caused you to have this emotional experience. And that just sort of grew throughout school. Ultimately majored in writing in college at the University of Illinois, and then wasn't sure what to do because I was an English major in college at the University of Illinois. So like most of those people, I don't know about most, but like many, I thought maybe I'll go to law school. So I went to work at a law firm in Chicago for a couple of years after college, which convinced me that I didn't want to go to law school, seeing that up close. But what I was doing was writing short stories on legal pads at my desk when I was supposed to be doing other work. And this was a sign that maybe I should spend some time writing. So I went back to graduate school for an MFA in creative writing at a place called McNeese State University in Lake Charles, Louisiana. And from there, I wish I could say I had some kind of grand plan for a career or anything like that. When I was in graduate school, I started teaching writing as a graduate student. When I had a quote unquote real world job after graduate school in market research back in Chicago, but when I got married and my wife wanted to go back and do more training for her profession as a veterinarian, we went back to the University of Illinois, and I was got a teaching job there. And then I'm like, oh, I really like this. And so over time, it just became this source of fascination. Like, if I'm interested in this, why wouldn't I try to spend as much time doing it as possible? And my orientation kind of became, okay, you have to live life. You wake up each morning, and why not wake up each morning and look forward to what you have to do that day? And reading and writing has proved to be a pretty good route to fulfilling that goal for myself.
John, you have authored several influential books, including Why They Can't Write and The Writer's Practice. Can you delve in a little bit more about the inspiration behind these books and maybe some of the challenges that they address within this topic of writing and education?
So both of those books are really rooted in my experience of 20 or so years of teaching college writing, primarily first year college writing, what we used to call freshman composition back when I went to college, but now we call first year writing in most cases. And seeing what I believe to be the disconnects between the experiences my first year college writing students had in high school or even before high school, and what I was asking them to do in college, where my students had learned to, and again, this sort of happened over time as more like as No Child Left Behind came in, and more accountability around assessment came in. Students had been coached to sort of create what I call writing simulations, things that look like writing but don't involve a genuine writing process or experience, by following a template, often a 5-paragraph essay. The full title of Why They Can't Write is Why They Can't Write, Killing the 5-Paragraph Essay and Other Necessities. The 5-paragraph essay isn't the problem. It's more of an avatar or symptom of what I thought was causing trouble, which is coaching students to do well in these assessments was keeping them from having the kinds of experiences that I thought were going to serve them well, not just in college, but in general. The kinds of what I call the writer's practice and are embedded in the writer's practice, which is a book of writing curriculum. I stopped calling them assignments. I call them experiences. The experiences that I ask students to do in my writing courses, the skills, knowledge, attitudes, and habits of mind of writers. If when we write, we employ these things, the skills, knowledge, attitudes, and habits of mind. And so I wanted students practicing these things while they were writing, worried less about does this meet the parameters for the grade, and more of what is the experience that's going on that helps them develop these practices. And it's a little bit of an illusion, because if people look at these books or come and see me talk at the conference, it'll be like, oh, he's talking like this is easy or straightforward. One of the things I always say is like the end result of my book, The Writer's Practice, was 8 years of iterative experiments towards these things as I altered my own approach to my teaching. It's really not so much you need to adopt somebody's curriculum, but to orient what you do in the classroom around the things you think are most important for students to do and learn and experience. And so my process was about bringing what I ask students to do and how I ask them to do it in line with what I thought was important, my values. And I realized a whole bunch of stuff that I'd sort of been trained to do or asked to do or had been doing kind of unthinkingly for, a decade or so, did not align with what I thought was important about helping students learn to write. So I went on this journey to try and change, and that just became that became my process, and ultimately it's a process that never ends. It's sort of the iterative experiment continues. The world changes, students change. Like COVID would have been a huge challenge to how we do these things, and now AI is another challenge to how we do these things. So it's much about sort of the mindset around how we look at writing in the classroom, as much as like, here's how you do it. I don't think there's any set method that's good forever, because the world is dynamic, and we should stay engaged with questions of how we do these things over time.
John, I love the focus that you have on those habits of mind. I think that focusing, to your point, focusing on those habits of mind is going to condition students to become better writers, better thinkers, better people in the long run than any kind of formulaic kind of writing or instruction might give them. That is one of those premises of our transitional English here in the state of Illinois, is thinking about how we instill critical thinking and analysis, that connection between reading and writing, getting students to think about their own thinking and who they are as writers and who they want to become as writers and what they want to communicate and who they want to communicate to. And none of that can be boxed up in a nice, neat little package. Interestingly, you mentioned AI. And so that's another, COVID was one landmark in our culture, and now we're moving on to the next. We're having conversations about artificial intelligence, and that has made a big impact for some of our educators across the nation, or at least has raised the question of what do we do with this? And so as we kind of grapple with that together, how can we, in today's digital age, as educators, as even community members, come together and continue to cultivate these critical thinking skills, this idea that we have to be critical consumers, we have to analyze what we read and how we then communicate that in our writing? How do we preserve that, given all of these new tools that our students have and our society has at its disposal?
Yeah, this is huge. I mean, there's a number of things overlapping here that I think are important to touch on. One is, I think you raise the proper frame for this, which is we should be treating this as a public problem. This is not a problem for individual instructors or even at the school level, right? Like we need a big public conversation around these issues so that we can hear different perspectives, sort through it, and figure out a path that makes sense. And it may not be path, it may be paths, right? The thing that I found frustrating, working with educators on these sorts of issues is often they're left to their own devices. Like, oh, just make a policy and do it. And I think on the one hand, yes, we need to maintain teacher autonomy over their own classrooms. On the other hand, people would love some guidance and insight into this stuff, and to have a framework that allows us to make policies that make sense rather than sort of doing a kind of individual ad hoc thing. So I think that's part of it. Another big question that has to be addressed with AI is the fact that this technology allows students to do schoolwork that can pass assessment muster without doing the work. It allows for an end run around the experience of learning. This is how I put it in my next book, which is called More Than Words, How to Think About Writing in the Age of AI, February 4th, 2025, people. The fact that, and you've probably seen the videos on TikTok or wherever, where students are like in like a lecture, and they're copying and pasting like stuff from the lecture and then getting the answer in real time from AI. And it's sort of like school is so easy now. It's like, well, you're not learning anything, right? And so we really have to be thoughtful about what do we want students to learn? How do we want them to learn it? What kinds of experiences are necessary for learning? And how do we motivate students to engage with those experiences, right? One of my, this was true prior to the advent of AI, but one of my concerns about what we've turned school into, and this is not just K-12, this is higher ed too, it's become kind of primarily transactional. Do this for this, do this for a grade, do this for a degree, do this for blah, blah, blah. And we now have this tool that can satisfy the transaction without the student doing anything. And we can try to police that as much as possible, although we have very few reliable tools for the policing of these things. Things like AI detectors are not particularly reliable and are not something I think we should rely on. So to my mind, we really have to think about engagement. How do we get students engaged with the experiences that we think are going to help them learn? Because again, in my experience, and this is longstanding before this stuff arrived, most students want to learn because most people want to learn. We are inherently curious. Humans are a species that is born out of curiosity. Go back to your Book of Genesis, serpent tempted Eve, right? I mean, this is whether we believe this literally or not. This is one of the founding texts of human attitudes towards the world, right? That we are curious, and there's a reason these stories get told about this. So, given that we are fundamentally curious and we like to learn things, and the experience of learning things is pleasurable, right? We feel better when we know something or can do something that we didn't do before. To my mind, there's nothing stopping us from building school around those things. And in doing so, I think students will learn more. I think they'll be able to pass all those assessments we want them to pass. But most of all, they'll be doing the work. They'll be having the experience. We will short circuit that transactional mode of school. And I think that transactional mode is bound up with all kinds of other things going in school, like where we look at things like chronic absenteeism or anxiety, even, and depression. It's sort of like, where is the meaning? What are we doing that makes us want to show up and do things? It was fascinating. I had no idea this was the case. Thinking of chronic absenteeism, New Trier High School, one of the rival high schools from the conference I grew up in, has a chronic absenteeism problem, right? This is not a poor school district. It's in fact the opposite. It could be the most well-resourced public school district in the entire country. And yet they have a chronic absenteeism problem, probably because their students know that the transactions can be satisfied no matter what they do. And they have parents who can cover for them if they don't want to, I don't want to go to school today. Okay, I'll get you an excuse. When even the best resource schools with absolutely the most highly qualified teachers and all the resources you could imagine have disengaged students, this is a big structural problem. And the AI isn't helpful, but it could help show the way out of the wilderness, I think. I mean, I think that's it. It's not something to be feared. Before we got on, I said I see it as an opportunity, not a threat. Generative AI cannot destroy anything that's worth preserving. The only people that can destroy something worth preserving is us. And so if we decide you don't need to read anymore because ChatGPT can summarize a text, that's on us. ChatGPT summarizing a text is not the same as us reading it, because when we read it, we think about it, we consider it, we put it in the context of other things we've encountered and we know. I think that is a fundamental part of the critical thinking. Angie, you're talking about, like, if we cannot take in text and think about it, we can never think critically. And writing is central to that, because one of my mantras is that writing is thinking, right? Writing is both the attempt to capture an idea and put it on the page, but the act of writing also often alters our own idea, right? We've all experienced this when we're writing. We thought we were going to say something, something comes to us while we're writing that alters the idea. That is an amazing, uniquely human experience. A generative AI, large language model, cannot and will not and can never do that. And when students experience that, I have some assignments in the writer's practice where the only assessment criteria they use to get an A if you do it, and you have to keep trying until it happens. So you get your A or you try again, is while you were writing, did you have a thought that you didn't have when you started? That's the entire thing. And when students experience this, when they recognize it, and then it's happened to them in their lives before, they just maybe haven't connected it with writing in school. Can be a transformative moment as they realize, oh wait, I can make stuff in my head. I can create knowledge. Something I didn't know before is now there, and it happened entirely in my own brain. That's an amazing thing. I mean, we shouldn't lose sight of how amazing that is that our brains do this. And the fact that a student may come up with an idea that somebody else also had a long time ago does not discount the quality of that idea having been created in that student's head. The bar is not they have to think of something nobody ever thought of before. It's they have to think of something they didn't think of before. So I think that's the challenge. That's always been the challenge. That was the challenge before this technology arrived. But I just think it's even more critical now, because we have these tools that can do the performance. We have these tools that can do the simulation of writing. Stop having students simulate writing when these things can do it. It was the least surprising thing in the world was when ChatGPT showed up and could crank out a 5-paragraph essay, because that thing has consumed billions of 5-paragraph essays. It's almost a machine built to make those things. So let's not do that, right? Let's do something else.
John, talking a little bit more about this idea of writing, and I'm probably aging myself because I grew up in the era where we went to the bottom of our dormitory to type our paper in the computer lab. And I started teaching when we had to make the transition from writing your paragraphs on notebook paper to the Chromebook that all the students had. So this idea of writing has definitely changed with the digital world that we're living in today. And everyone on this, Angie, yourself, and me included, we can attest to that. We have seen that. What do you say about this idea that writing still needs to be a vital skill? And how do we enforce isn't probably the right word. How do we continue to teach our students strong writing skills and appreciate the idea of actually writing when we're living in this continually evolving digital world?
I'm going to date myself even more and say I went to college with a typewriter. I got my first computer junior year. It was actually a typewriter that had like a little LCD screen on it where it displayed like maybe 30 characters, so you could interrupt a typo if you caught it immediately. I once tried to explain to my students what whiteout was and why that might be necessary, and they were baffled. That's crazy. They're like, you used to be able to handwrite corrections on your paper. I'm like, well, yeah, versus typing the whole thing again. That was okay. Anyway, yes, we are old. I mean, so one of the things that your framing brings up is that tools of automation have steadily changed our notions of what students need to learn when they write, right? Um, like keyboarding, like how to type, or I'll date myself more, how to write cursive, right? Was a huge purpose of my grade school education. A bad one because I always got needs improvement on my cursive because I had lousy, and still do. I probably can't even write cursive anymore. I was liberated by the typewriter. I could finally actually say things because I could type. We don't teach like typing anymore, but typing was a class when I was in school. Um, Research, right? Like I grew up with the card catalog and the Reader's Guide to Periodical Literature, and we had to go look at these things, right? All of that has been automated in amazing, and I would argue overall helpful ways, right? It's increased our ability to access information and use these things. Like I just wrote this next book in a matter of months, citing literally hundreds of sources. It would have taken me years to find those things if I had been um, working with the tools that were around when I was in middle school. Um, I couldn't even done it because I would read something the same day I would put it in my book. Like it appeared online in a publication and it came to my attention to be like, ooh, that goes here. Unthinkable, right? In the 1980s when I was in middle school and high school. Spell check, grammar check. These are all tools of automation that I would argue by and large are on balance helpful to the act of writing if we look at what I think is the core of writing, which is this act of expression to communicate with audiences in specific rhetorical situations. So we can't dismiss automation as a de facto bad. The question is, does this new tool of sort of hyper automation, what does it threaten, and what does it leave out, right? In terms of process. And for me, it gets back to that idea of writing is thinking. When I see teachers say like, well, I encourage my students to let it do their first draft and give them something to work with. I'm like, I think that's the worst thing, because that first draft is where the thinking happens, right? I'm dubious about using the technology as a tool for feedback because I know it can't read. It doesn't think, it doesn't feel, it doesn't communicate with intention. That said, I've seen some experiments with this technology where it generates feedback that I read the feedback. I'm like, oh, that's pretty good advice, right? So we have to think about this work and what's meaningful about it. And at its core, um, reading and writing is the vehicle that allows us as individuals to take in, consider, and then express what we think about the world and the things we know in the world. It changes us from sort of passive vessels of content flowing at us in an endless stream, right? Like this is kind of one of the chief problems of life in society today. There's too much information, right? We're bombarded with this stuff. We take in, this was a study from many years ago, but it was something like a human walking the earth today takes in more information in an hour than somebody living in like the Middle Ages would have had in their lifetime, right? There's too much. Reading critically, right? And writing is a way to make sense of that stuff. And that's why I think it's vital. It's more than just, oh, I have to produce a text for a purpose, like my boss wants it, or my teacher wants it, or something like that. It's how do we take this in and use it to make something of substance? The job I had after graduate school in a market research firm, I was producing reports all the time, right? Analysis of data and this kind of stuff. Some of that could be probably automated, right? Where it's just a literal translation of numbers into text. But the real added value was, what do those numbers mean? How do we interpret those numbers as meaningful information about the behavior of people? And that can really only be done by something that can think and reason and think creatively and reason based on a sort of existing body of experience and that kind of stuff. Um, one of the distinctions I always make is humans are literally embodied. We walk the earth, we are on the earth, we have our senses, we experience the earth through these our lives through these senses. And we have experiences that we encode in our brains as memory and have meaning and this kind of stuff. And none of this is part of the architecture of a large language model. Large language models ingest syntax and spit it back out. And what they do is amazing. It is an absolute marvel of technology. And even having spent hours and hours and hours interacting with these things, I'm still occasionally blown away by what they're able to do. But what they're able to do is not what we do when we write and when we read and when we think about these things. So I absolutely worry that we're going to devalue writing and reading, that we've decided that if this thing can do it and it's more efficient and whatever. I think we're looking at a very grim, impoverished existence as people, not like workers or students or whatever, if we lose sight of these things. I hope in 100 years somebody doesn't unearth this podcast and think like, oh, look at those people talking about that dead activity that nobody does anymore because we plug the brain ports into our brainstem and just download everything instantly. I, I don't think I'm old-fashioned. I don't think I'm afraid of technology. I use technology to do all these things all the time. I just think we live lives that should have meaning, and this is a way to experience lives of meaning. Always has been for an awfully long time. Books are a very old technology. Communication is a very fundamental and extremely old human activity. So why not continue to value those things? To me, that's not going away.
John, that's a lot to unpack. And this whole conversation has just been a lot to unpack. There are some big themes that I think I'm hearing from you, including I love the fact that you mentioned that we don't want to create just kind of passive vessels for information to flow through and kind of spit out and regurgitate. We really want to build these citizens, these students, these people who think critically and are able to communicate their thoughts and ideas and transform the thoughts and ideas of others. And so, what an opportunity we have coming up here on Friday, December 13th at our third annual Transitional English Language Arts Summit to bring together a community of learners and educators ranging from post-secondary faculty to high school English teachers to administrators and counselors and anyone else who would like to attend, really kind of digging into some of your ideas. I want to press you with all of the things that we've been talking about here this morning on our Teacher Talk. What is maybe one thing, because this is a unique opportunity to bring all these people together, as a result of kind of listening to you that morning, what's one thing that maybe you hope those educators, those policymakers, those higher ed faculty walk away with after participating?
Yeah, it goes back to what I was just talking about, that writing is a unique human experience. And it's something that we should find value in beyond the transaction of doing something for school or for our employer or something like that. It really is something that is unique to how we interact with the world. And to help students experience that creates, in my mind, it's that you guys taught, so you know what this is like. You have sort of that student where not much is happening in general, and suddenly, sometimes without even meaning to, you switch them to the on position, and it's all of a sudden like, oh, something happened and they're taking it in. I believe, I would believe this because I'm a writer, but I think writing has a unique potential for that kind of thing. For to help students become exactly what you're talking about, Angie, which is when you say citizens, I think of like, yes, like they need to be agents in the world. They need to have agency. They need to be able to act according to their own unique set of experiences and values. And often I think students struggle with believing that school wants them to be those people because it does value um, following rules and conformity, and there's reasons why we need those sorts of guidelines. But ultimately, we're going to send them in the world to make their way. And again, writing and reading the communications of others, and then communicating in turn back to them. That's just I think it's a fundamental, not just skill, but experience that is ultimately empowering for students and also very fun for teachers to see when it happens. It's why I've spent the bulk of my adult life for the past 25 years thinking about these things.
Well, John, we are so excited to have you at our third annual Transitional English Language Arts Summit. But I do want to add something as we close up our time here on Teacher Talk. The conversations that we've had today go well beyond the scope of an English classroom. It goes well beyond the scope of a transitional English classroom. It goes well beyond our K-12 and our post-secondary institutions. We're really thinking about building those critical consumers, as you mentioned, those agents, those citizens who are prepared, no matter the time, the place, the circumstance, to think critically, to reflect upon their own thinking and their own values and their own takeaways and communicate their message back out to the world. And as you pointed out, this type of education, this type of learning is about process, it's about experiences, engagement, curiosity. And I love the fact that you mentioned that writing is thinking, changing our own thinking as well as the thinking of others. So we are tremendously excited to welcome you back on Friday, December 13th to have more of those conversations, to get our participants thinking about their own thinking as well as we look to revolutionize some of our instruction and priorities and values when it comes to education and the art and craft of teaching, reading, and writing. Friends, that wraps us up here today for this edition of Teacher Talk. We would like to say thank you so much to our special guest today, author, columnist, educator, John Warner, who will be with us at our Transitional English Summit on Friday, December 13th. Also, special thank you to my friend, colleague, and co-host, Ms. Stacy Dingus. This was a real pleasure for the two of us to dig back into our literacy roots and our time in the classroom for sure. If you are sitting here listening and would like to attend our third annual Transitional English Language Arts Summit on Friday, December 13th from 8:30 to noon, virtual. So you can do it right from the comfort of your own classroom or living room or office basement, wherever that might be. Please check out the details included in this post and head on over to www.ROE47.org to register. We'd love to have you there. In the meantime, we would like to wish you a very happy, joyful, restful rest of your Thursday, and even better Friday, a nice, relaxing fall weekend. And we'll see you right back here next Thursday for another edition of Teacher Talk.